9,000 feet above sea level. In the winter of 1883, the mountains here did not show mercy. She arrived with 2 trunks and a child, and something in her eyes the town had never seen before.
She pressed her fingers into the ground, and she understood something no one else in that valley understood yet.
They had all agreed. She was wrong, and they were going to tell her so.
5 of them. One of her. And she did not turn around.
The wagon road into Harrow Gulch narrowed at the final bend, squeezed between 2 granite shoulders that dripped ice even in October, and anyone arriving for the first time understood immediately that the mountains here were not decorative. They were structural. They formed the walls of a world that operated by different rules than the one most people had left behind. The Elk Ridge Range did not negotiate with human ambition. It simply presented its terms, and those who remained did so because they had either made peace with the conditions or had not yet been broken by them. Zofia Brandt arrived on an October morning with 2 trunks, a 5-year-old daughter, and no visible sign of uncertainty. The wagon driver who brought her from the Durango stage connection watched her climb down without assistance, lift Marta to the ground with one fluid motion, then stand in the frozen mud of Harrow Gulch's main thoroughfare and look at the mountains surrounding the settlement as though she were reading something written there. He had brought dozens of newcomers up that road. Most of them looked at the mountains the way people look at a sentence they cannot parse. Zofia looked at them the way someone looks at a page they have read before, in a different book, in a different language, but the same argument. She was 34 years old. She had crossed the Atlantic, then the continent, then 3 mountain passes in a hired wagon to reach this place. Her husband had not completed the journey. He was buried in a churchyard outside Kansas City, taken by fever 6 weeks before they would have arrived, and the stone above him bore a name that the gravediggers had spelled incorrectly because neither of them spoke the language well enough to correct the other. Zofia had looked at the misspelled stone for a long time before she climbed back into the wagon with Marta and continued west. There was nothing left to go back to. There was only the letter from Father Brendan, her father's cousin's son, who managed the small Catholic congregation in Harrow Gulch, and had written, before her husband died, that there was work for a seamstress and decent people in the settlement if she was willing to endure the altitude. She was willing to endure more than altitude. The cabin Father Brendan had arranged for her was on the eastern edge of the settlement, where the morning shadow of Elk Ridge fell longest. It measured 16 feet by 20, with plank walls that admitted wind through a dozen gaps and a floor of rough-cut pine that had never been sealed. The previous occupant, a bachelor miner named Cruz who had left for the Nevada silver fields in August, had installed a cast-iron stove in the northwest corner, a battered 60-pound unit with a cracked firebox door that someone had wired shut with a length of copper wire. The stove still functioned, technically. Zofia looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds when she first arrived, long enough to understand its capabilities, then looked at the walls, the ceiling height, the placement of the single window, the direction of the prevailing wind based on the frost patterns on the glass. She set Marta down on one of the trunks with a wool blanket around her shoulders and began moving through the cabin the way a doctor moves through a patient's history, noting what was present and what was missing. What was missing was survival, not the crude kind, not food or shelter in the most basic sense. The cabin would not collapse. The roof, recently retarred by Father Brendan's volunteers, would not let in significant snow, but the crew's stove, burning its best, would create a sphere of survivable warmth within 4 feet of its surface and leave the rest of the cabin to the mathematics of Colorado winter at 9,200 feet above sea level. Marta slept in the northeast corner, furthest from the stove. That corner, Zofia calculated by touch and instinct, and something that was not quite either, would reach 35 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest nights of January. Maybe 30. A child could not sleep in 35 degrees for 5 months. Zofia began the next morning. The clay deposit she had located on her second day in Harrow Gulch lay 3 miles upstream along the creek that gave the settlement its water supply. She had found it while walking Marta along the bank. Marta liked to throw pebbles into the slow winter current, and had stopped when she saw the color of the exposed bank where the water had cut away the earth. Gray-blue, dense, the kind of clay that held its shape under pressure without crumbling, that resisted cracking under thermal stress better than the red-brown variety common to lower elevations. She had scraped a small amount free with her thumbnail, rolled it between her fingers, pressed it against her palm. It held the impression of her fingerprint perfectly. She had looked at the creek, looked at the sky, looked at Marta, who was watching a waterbird navigate the shallows downstream. That evening she wrote in the small journal she kept in her coat pocket, "The material is here, everything else is labor." She began hauling clay in a borrowed wheelbarrow 3 miles each direction, rising before Marta woke so that Father Brendan could look after the girl during the morning hours. The priest was a small, careful man in his mid-50s who wore his concern for Zofia openly, the way people wear expressions when they believe the person they are worried about cannot read faces well. He was wrong about that. Zofia could read faces with the precision of someone who had spent years in situations where misreading them was expensive. She simply chose not to react to what she read, which Father Brendan consistently mistook for obliviousness. The river rock she selected by sound, striking each stone against another and listening for the ring of dense, uniform material rather than the dull thud of something porous or fissured. Fist-sized, roughly spherical, drawn from the deepest part of the creek bed where water pressure had done the most sorting. She filled a canvas sack on each trip, carrying it alongside the wheelbarrow load. By the end of the first week, her shoulders ached in a specific architectural way, the kind of soreness that comes not from overexertion but from repetition, from the body learning a new load it will have to carry for a long time. The floor reinforcement came next. Before a single brick of clay was laid, this was not compromise, this was engineering. 4,000 pounds of clay, sand, and stone could not be placed on a standard plank floor designed for a bachelor miner's possessions and the occasional poker game. It would collapse through within a season, and with it the entire purpose of the undertaking. Zofia engaged the services of a young man named Cale Pitts, who worked as an apprentice to Declan Fogarty and spent his afternoons looking for additional work to supplement his modest wages. She paid him with 2 weeks of mending shirts, trousers, a torn canvas jacket, and in exchange he spent 2 days beneath the cabin reinforcing the floor joists, distributing the load across 8 structural members rather than the standard 4, sistering new timber against the existing framing wherever the wood had begun to check or soften. Cale Pitts was 19 and did not ask questions about why the floor needed reinforcing. This made him enormously useful. The project that was visible above the floor began in the 3rd week of October. The design lived in Zofia's hands before it lived anywhere else. She had watched the original constructed when she was 11 years old, in the house of a prosperous family for whom her mother had worked as a domestic. The builder had been an old man from farther east, tight-spoken, who worked with the methodical confidence of someone who had done the same thing 30 times and expected to do it 30 more. Zofia had watched him for 3 weeks from every angle she could manage without being noticed, understanding not just the sequence of actions but the reasoning behind each one, why the firebox was proportioned that way, why the channels reversed direction at specific intervals, why the chimney emerged through the roof at that particular angle. By the time the old man finished, she had drawn the cross-section from memory in the margin of a school book. She still had the drawing. It was in the second trunk, folded inside a linen cloth beside her marriage documents. She did not need to look at it. The firebox went up first at the base, brick-shaped clay forms tamped into dense uniformity, opening size precisely to accept the specific configuration of wood she intended to burn, not logs sprawled in every direction, but upright, organized, positioned to achieve the maximum combustion temperature in the minimum time. Above the firebox, the structure began its interior complexity. The flue channels, 6 inches in diameter, running vertically, then reversing horizontally, then vertically again, forced the combustion gases on an 18-foot journey through dense clay mass before they reached the chimney opening. Zofia built each channel freehand without a template, shaping the interior passages the way a river shapes a canyon, by understanding what she wanted the moving element to do and building the walls that would compel it. The river rocks she packed into the core of the structure where they would absorb and hold the deepest heat, insulated by surrounding clay, releasing their stored warmth long after the rocks themselves would have been scorching hot to touch if exposed. Marta sat on a low stool each afternoon and watched. She asked questions in the uninhibited, relentless way of 5-year-olds, without concern for whether the questions were welcome or the timing was good. Zofia did not look up from where she was pressing a fresh layer of clay against the second vertical channel when Marta asked why it was so tall. Because warm air goes up. The taller it is, the more the warm air can move through the room. Like a chimney? Not like a chimney. A chimney lets the heat escape. This makes the heat stay. Marta considered this. Where does the heat stay? Zofia pressed her palm flat against the surface of the clay she had just laid, feeling its texture, its density, whether it had bonded correctly to the layer below. In the clay, in the stone, the heat goes inside and waits there, like hiding, like remembering. The girl turned this over in her mind with the seriousness that children bring to information adults have offered without condescension. She did not ask the next question that day. She saved it the way children save things they are not yet sure how to use. The structure rose through the end of October. 8 feet when finished, it would dominate the cabin's floor space the way a fireplace dominates a formal room, except that it was not decorative. Every cubic inch of it had a function. The surface would radiate heat at temperatures between 110 and 130 degrees, warm enough to feel immediately, gentle enough to press a hand against without flinching, perfect for establishing the whole room convection currents that would carry warmth to the corners where Marta slept. The difference between this surface temperature and the 300 to 400 degree surface of a cast iron stove was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of physics. A cast iron stove radiated heat in straight lines, creating scorched zones immediately adjacent to the metal and abandoning everything beyond 6 feet to the ambient cold. The clay surface would warm the air in contact with it, send that air rising to the ceiling, watch it migrate across the room as it cooled, then pull it back down along the exterior walls to be reheated at the stove's surface and rise again. The cabin would not have a warm side and a cold side, it would simply be warm. Harrow Gulch noticed the project in stages. The first stage was curiosity, which lasted approximately 4 days. Neighbors walked past the half-finished cabin with the open door through which the growing clay structure was visible, paused, looked, moved on. People in mining settlements develop a tolerance for eccentric behavior because the work itself is eccentric. Tunneling into rock faces looking for silver veins is not a conservative enterprise, but eccentricity usually has a recognizable shape. What Zofia was building had no recognizable shape. It looked, depending on the angle, like something between a grain silo and a bread oven, enormous and primitive and somehow both overbuilt and wrong-headed at the same time. The second stage was concern, which arrived in the form of Declan Fogarty on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November. He was a large man, Fogarty, broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands that had the texture of worked leather and a voice shaped by County Cork and 30 years of raising it over construction noise. He had built 47 structures in and around Harrow Gulch over 8 years. He had watched buildings fail in every way buildings can fail at high altitude: frost heave, foundation settling, roof collapse under snow load, chimney fires, wall failures from improperly cured lumber. He had opinions about construction the way theologians have opinions about virtue, considered, deeply held, and tolerant of very little deviation. He stopped his wagon outside Zofia's door and called through the opening because the cold had made standing still unpleasant even for a man of his bulk. "Mrs. Brant." His voice carried the particular combination of authority and reluctant concern that men use when they have decided to involve themselves in someone else's problem without having asked permission. "That mud structure won't heat anything come December. You're wasting good floor space and burning daylight on something that physics won't support." Zofia's hands did not slow. She was pressing the third horizontal channel into shape, smoothing the inner curve of the turn where the gases would reverse direction, and this required consistent pressure maintained over a specific distance. Breaking the rhythm would affect the structural integrity of the curve. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Fogarty," she said without looking up. Fogarty waited a moment, apparently under the impression that she had not fully understood him. "A proper cast iron stove costs $12 at Murphy's. That's the proven solution at this elevation. 9,000 feet changes everything about how heat behaves." Zofia continued pressing clay. The channel curve was nearly complete. "I appreciate it," she said. He left. The conversation had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Rupert Calloway came that same afternoon, which suggested coordination, though Zofia suspected it was the organic coordination of a small community where information moves through proximity rather than planning. Calloway managed the Lucky Elk mine, which meant he was accustomed to making decisions that other people then implemented, which meant he was accustomed to a certain responsiveness in the people he addressed. He was in his mid-40s, lean in the way of men who work outdoors in cold climates, with 19 Colorado winters visible in the set of his eyes. His son Owen, 10 years old, had a respiratory history that made Calloway cautious about cold in the way fathers become cautious about specific dangers when a child has already been hurt by them. He stood in the doorway rather than entering, which was either courtesy or reluctance. "Ma'am, I've watched desperation push people toward bad decisions before. That clay is going to crack at first, hard freeze. When it does, what happens to your little girl while you're starting over from nothing?" Zofia set down the smoothing tool she had been using and straightened her back carefully, the way you do when you have been bent over for several hours. She looked at Calloway with an expression that was neither hostile nor warm, simply present, the way a doctor looks at a patient's chart before delivering an assessment. "She'll be warm," Zofia said. "By the time the hard freeze comes, she'll be warm." Calloway's jaw shifted slightly. He had prepared for argument or gratitude and received neither. "Your stubbornness could cost that child," he said, his voice tightening around the words as though the concern had converted itself to something harder. "That's not a judgment, it's arithmetic." He walked back to his wagon without waiting for a response. Zofia returned to her work. Dr. Elias Vane arrived the following morning, and his approach was different from the others in that he led with credentials rather than experience. 12 years of medical practice in Colorado Territory, he mentioned in his first sentence, which established both his authority and the frame through which he intended to view the situation. He was a careful man, methodical, who kept detailed records and trusted quantifiable evidence. He had treated 3 deaths from cold exposure the previous February, had written about them in his medical journal in clinical language that did not quite conceal the fact that losing patients to preventable causes disturbed him in a persistent, low-grade way. Clay doesn't conduct heat efficiently, he told Zofia, standing just inside the doorway. That's basic physics. Iron conducts heat rapidly because of its molecular structure. Clay lacks that capacity. What you're building may retain warmth in the material itself, but it won't transfer that warmth to the surrounding air with any useful speed. Zofia looked at him for a moment. Dr. Vane was not wrong about the conductivity difference. He was wrong about what that difference meant in the context of the system she was building. But she did not have the English vocabulary yet to explain the distinction between conductive transfer and radiative release, between the rate of heat input and the duration of heat output. She had the concepts. She had lived inside the concepts. The words in this language were still assembling themselves into the right shapes. The clay doesn't need to conduct quickly, she said carefully. Its job is to hold. Vane nodded slowly, the way educated men nod when they have heard something that doesn't fit their model. I hope you're right, he said, which meant he was certain she wasn't. Augustus Finch arrived on Friday with a notebook already open to a fresh page, which established him immediately as a different kind of visitor. He was the engineer who managed the mechanical systems of the Lucky Elk mine, pumps, hoists, the narrow gauge rail that moved ore from the face to the surface, and he approached unfamiliar systems with the genuine curiosity of someone who found problems interesting rather than threatening. He was also, in this case, genuinely wrong, but he was wrong in a more sophisticated way than the others, which made him simultaneously more useful and more confident in his error. He studied the structure from multiple angles before speaking. He asked about the dimensions of the firebox, the diameter of the flue channels, the approximate weight of the combined material. He did arithmetic in the notebook margin that Zofia could see without reading ratios, thermal calculations, penciled figures crossed out and replaced. Then he looked up with the expression of a man who has worked through the problem and arrived at a clear answer. The thermal mass is your problem. Too much mass, not enough surface area. By the time you heat 4,000 pounds of clay to a useful temperature, you've burned through a week's worth of wood. Then it radiates so slowly you'll freeze before it has meaningful effect. There's a reason we don't build this way. Zofia listened to all of it. She understood the calculation he was making. It was the correct calculation for a system designed to operate the way he was imagining: slow heat input, slow heat release, inefficient in both directions. What he was not accounting for was the firebox temperature. The heat she would drive into this clay mass would not be the moderate, sustained heat of a stove banked for overnight burning. It would be the concentrated, complete combustion of wood burned intensely hot for a short time, pushing temperatures above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit into the clay and stone, charging the thermal battery in a rapid, furious 2-hour burn that then released its stored energy over the following 18 to 22 hours. The math was not the same math he was doing, but she did not have the English for it yet. You may be right, she told Augustus Finch, which was the truest false thing she could have said. He closed his notebook and left looking satisfied. Constance Aldrich arrived on Saturday afternoon with a wicker basket containing preserved vegetables, which was an act of genuine generosity wrapped around a social visit that had been organized specifically to deliver a message. Constance was the wife of the settlement's assayer, a position that made her husband important and made her by association the nearest thing to social authority that a mining camp of 340 people possessed. She was perhaps 40, precise in her speech, careful in her dress even in a place where careful dressing was difficult. She surveyed the clay structure with the expression of someone examining an architectural choice they find distressing. I understand you're trying to economize, she said. Her voice was not unkind. It had the particular quality of someone who has decided that pity is more appropriate than judgment. But Colorado winters kill people. We lost 3 souls last February. This isn't the climate for experiments, particularly for a woman alone with a young child. She paused. What may have worked in your home country won't necessarily work at altitude. The conditions are simply different. Zofia accepted the basket with genuine thanks. The preserved vegetables would be useful. I appreciate your concern for Marta, she said. Constance waited for more, received nothing, gathered her coat around her, left. There was one more visitor before the group visit that would end the sequence. Father Brendan found Zofia after Sunday Mass, drawing her aside into the small room off the nave where he kept the church records. He was the only one of the 5 who understood that what he was about to say would not change her course, which meant his concern was not really about the stove at all. It was about what would happen to her in this community if the stove failed. He had watched mining settlements develop their opinions of newcomers, had watched those opinions calcify into permanent assessment based on early evidence, had watched capable people lose years of potential standing to a single visible failure. The community is worried, he said, meeting her eyes directly. I'm worried. Not about the engineering necessarily, but about what happens to your position here if this doesn't work. You need these people. You need their business, their goodwill, their trust. If this stove fails in January, you'll spend the next 5 years trying to recover from the impression it creates. He held her gaze. Let the church provide a proper stove. There's no shame in accepting help. Zofia looked at her cousin relation who had traveled a great distance to warn her against a risk that he understood as social and she understood as thermal. She felt genuine affection for him. She also felt with equal clarity that she could not explain to him in any language that would satisfy him why she was certain she was right. Marta needs to be warm, she said. That's the whole of it, Father. He sighed the sigh of a man who has done what he can. I'll pray it works, he said. So will I, she told him, which was the first time she had admitted any uncertainty to anyone, and she said it quietly enough that he almost missed it. The group visit came on the first Monday of November. Zofia saw them coming from the window, 5 figures walking together up the road from the center of the settlement, Fogarty in front with his characteristic purposeful stride, Calloway at his shoulder, Vane slightly behind, Finch with his notebook already visible under one arm, Constance walking with the deliberate pace of someone who has agreed to participate in something distasteful because they believe it is necessary. Father Brendan was not among them, which told Zofia that he had either refused to be part of it or had not been invited. She opened the door before they reached it. She invited them in, all 5 of them. The cabin was not large and the clay structure occupied its generous share of the floor space. So the 5 visitors arranged themselves in an awkward arc between the door and the structure's bulk, looking at it the way people look at evidence they have already decided how to interpret. Zofia filled the small coffee pot and set it on the cruise stove, which she still used for cooking, and waited. They would speak. They would not be able to help themselves. 5 people who had each individually decided they needed to say something would not collectively find silence tolerable. Fogarty spoke first, then Calloway, then Vane, then Finch with the notebook open as though he might reference his calculations. Constance made her point about the community's concern with the careful diction of someone who has rehearsed. Each of them said in their own register approximately the same thing. This will not work. The physics are wrong. Your child is at risk. There is still time to make a different choice. Zofia listened to all of it. She poured the coffee when it was ready and offered cups to anyone who wanted them. She let the room finish speaking. Then she set her own cup down on the edge of the table and looked at each of them in turn without particular expression. Thank you, she said. All of you, I know you mean well. A pause, brief and complete. Would anyone like to watch me mix the next layer? She turned back to the structure and picked up her tools. No one stayed to watch. They filed out in the particular silence of people who have prepared extensively for a conversation that did not go the direction they prepared for. Fogarty was the last one out. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the clay structure, then at Zofia's back, then at Marta on her stool watching her mother work. He put his hat on. He left. Calloway said something to him outside that Zofia could not hear. Fogarty's response carried through the November air in fragments, the tone if not the words. Either she knows something we don't, or she doesn't know enough to be frightened. By December we'll know which. The curing process began on November 15th. The stove was finished 8 feet high, 4,000 pounds of clay, sand, and river stone, a maze of internal channels, a sealed chimney passage through the roof, a surface that covered nearly a quarter of the cabin's floor space and rose from slab to ceiling with the solidity of something geological. It looked wrong in the way that things built for function rather than aesthetic often look wrong, too large, too dense, too committed to a single purpose. It looked like it had always been there. Zofia started the first fire small, intentionally, carefully small, kindling only 10 minutes, enough to bring moisture out of the clay nearest the firebox without thermal shock. She let the structure cool completely overnight. The following morning she built a slightly larger fire, still modest, holding it for 20 minutes. The day after, larger again, 30 minutes, more wood. She moved through the curing sequence with the patience of someone who has learned that rushed processes create flawed outcomes, and flawed outcomes at 9,000 feet in November are not recoverable. 3 days of gradual escalating heat, no shortcuts, no impatience, no cracks appeared. On the 4th day she burned the first real fire, 6 pieces of wood, 2 hours, the firebox temperature climbing to the point where the flame turned from orange to white at its core. He felt the outer surface of the clay with her palm at 1-hour intervals. At first it was merely warm, then warmer. By the end of the 2nd hour it was radiating a steady, pervasive heat that felt nothing like the focused, aggressive output of the cruise stove. It felt the way stone feels after a full day of July sun, not hot, but saturated, as though the warmth lived inside the material and was choosing to share itself. She let the fire burn out completely. An hour after the last flame died, she touched the outer surface again. Still warm. 2 hours later, still warm. She moved through the cabin at intervals through the evening, noting the temperature at the far corner where Marta slept, at the window, at the door. The range was smaller than anything she had experienced in a mechanically heated space. 45 minutes after the fire went out, the thermometer Father Brendan had lent her read 61 degrees at the northeast corner of the cabin, the corner where Marta slept. Marta was already in bed, already asleep, still dressed in her wool-day clothes because the cabin had been cold until recently. Zofia sat down on the edge of the sleeping pallet and looked at her daughter's face in the lamplight. Marta's lips were not purple. Her hands, extended beyond the edge of the blanket, were not curled inward for warmth. She was simply asleep, the uncomplicated sleep of a child who is comfortable. Zofia sat with that for a while. Outside, the neighbors who passed in the late afternoon had seen no smoke from the cabin's chimney and concluded what they had predicted, that the clay stove had failed, or was failing, or had been quietly abandoned in favor of some more conventional approach. A few of them felt something between vindication and relief, the particular combination that arrives when you believe someone you have been worrying about has finally made the sensible choice. They did not knock on the door to confirm. They simply noted the absence of smoke and moved on, carrying their conclusions home with them. The absence of smoke meant something different than they thought it meant. It meant the fire was finished. It meant the work of heating was done for the day. It meant that inside that cabin, a structure of clay and riverstone was discharging its stored warmth at a rate that would sustain a temperature above 60 degrees until morning, without flame, without fuel, without anyone waking at 2 in the morning to feed a dying stove. Marta rolled slightly in her sleep and pulled the blanket up without waking. She was warm. Zofia pressed her palm one final time against the clay surface. It pushed warmth back against her hand with the patient, total certainty of something that is absorbed enough to give and give and give. She thought of the old builder watching her, knowing she was watching him, never saying a word about it. She thought about what her daughter had asked her, weeks ago now, when they were still only beginning. Does the earth forget? She had not answered then. She knew the answer. She had simply been saving it for when Marta could feel the proof under her own small hand. Outside, the wind moved down from Elk Ridge with a sound like held breath releasing. The first real cold was still weeks away, but it was coming. Everyone in Harrow Gulch could feel it in the specific way that people who have survived high-altitude winters feel approaching cold, not as weather but as weight, settling over the settlement like something that had been watching from the peaks all autumn and had finally decided it was time. The clay held its warmth, the cabin held its quiet, the child slept. Augustus Finch returned on a Thursday in the third week of November, alone this time, without the social architecture of the group visit to give his presence official weight. He came with his notebook open before he reached the door, which told Zofia that whatever had brought him back was not courtesy but compulsion, the particular restlessness of an engineer who has worked through a problem and arrived at an answer that conflicts with the one he gave publicly. She let him in without comment. Marta was at the table with a primer Father Brendan had loaned her, tracing letters with a charcoal stick, her tongue pressed against her upper lip in concentration. Finch stood in front of the stove for a long moment. It was mid-morning. Zofia had completed her daily burn 3 hours earlier, 4 pieces of wood, 2 hours, the firebox brought to full combustion temperature before being allowed to exhaust itself cleanly. The cabin registered 63 degrees on the borrowed thermometer. Outside, the air temperature had dropped to 22 during the night and had not climbed significantly since dawn. "May I ask some questions?" Finch's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who is prepared to be wrong. "Technical questions, not the other kind." Zofia set down the seam she was mending. "Go ahead." He began with dimensions, then moved to material composition, then to the channel configuration. His questions had the precision of someone who had been doing arithmetic in private and needed specific values to complete the calculation. How much did the structure weigh total? What was the interior channel diameter? At what temperature did she estimate the firebox during peak burn? She answered each question with the same directness. No elaboration, no defense, just figures. When he asked about the flue gas exit temperature, she told him she estimated 250 degrees Fahrenheit based on what she could observe at the chimney opening. He wrote that number down twice, as though once might be insufficient. Then he went quiet, pencil moving through several lines of calculation in the notebook margin. The scratching of the pencil was the only sound in the cabin for nearly 2 minutes. Marta glanced up once, decided this was not interesting, returned to her letters. Finch stopped writing. He looked at the number at the bottom of his calculation, then at the stove, then back at the number. His expression underwent a small, controlled revision, the way a landscape changes when clouds shift and the light reorganizes itself across the same terrain. A cast iron stove expels flue gas at 600 to 800 degrees, he said, not to Zofia specifically, not as question or challenge, but as someone speaking aloud to make certain they have understood their own calculation. 600 to 800 degrees going straight up the chimney, wasted. Your system expels at 250. He paused. The efficiency gap isn't marginal, Zofia waited. Clay holds 0.24 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, he continued, pencil scratching again. Iron holds 0.11. If your total mass is 4,000 pounds clay plus stone, the storage capacity is approximately 950 BTU per degree of temperature increase. He worked through the next calculation, crossed out one figure, corrected it. If you heat this structure to 400 degrees internally, you're storing roughly 380,000 BTU of thermal energy. He looked up. A standard cast iron stove at 300 degrees surface temperature stores approximately 4,800 BTU. Your system stores 79 times more heat from the same fire. The number sat between them. Zofia said nothing. She had known this, had known it the way you know things that live in the body before they live in language. But hearing it expressed as arithmetic gave it a different kind of solidity. It became arguable, provable, the kind of knowledge that could be written in a letter or explained to a skeptic in a language they trusted. Finch closed the notebook slowly. I told you this wouldn't work, he said. His voice had the quality of a man choosing his words with more care than usual. I calculated the thermal mass as a liability, too much material to heat efficiently, too slow to release it. I was applying the correct principles to the wrong system. A pause long enough to be deliberate. I'd like to observe a full burn cycle. If you're willing. Come Thursday morning, Zofia told him. Before 7, he was there at 6:45. What he observed that Thursday he recorded in the notebook with the thoroughness of someone who understood they were documenting something that would matter later. 20 minutes to build the fire properly, kindling layered in specific progression from small to large, establishing combustion temperature before the primary fuel was introduced. 90 minutes of sustained high heat burning, 4 logs introduced at intervals, the firebox temperature climbing to the point where the flame lost color at its center. 30 minutes of burn down, the fire consuming itself to white ash without additional fuel, total burn time 2 hours 40 minutes. Total wood, 36 pounds. He took temperature readings at the outer surface of the stove at 15-minute intervals during the burn, then every 30 minutes after the fire extinguished. He took cabin temperature at 6 locations. He came back the following morning at 6 o'clock, before Zofia had started the day's fire, to take the readings again, measuring what the structure held after 18 hours without flame. The cabin was 59 degrees at the northeast corner, 59 degrees 18 hours after the last piece of wood had turned to ash. He wrote at the bottom of the page, in letters slightly larger than his usual notation, Iron stove 4800 BTU stored. Clay system 380 a BTU stored. Efficiency iron stove 40 to 50%, clay system 75 to 85%. My error treating mass as inefficiency rather than capacity. The system is not slow, it is deep. He did not share this with anyone yet. He told himself he needed more data. He needed a genuinely cold night, not merely a cold morning. He needed to see the system perform under real pressure before he put his name behind a public revision of the opinion he had delivered with such confidence in November. This was reasonable caution. It was also, though he would not have described it this way, the particular reluctance of a man who has been definitively wrong in front of people he respects and is not yet ready to say so. He came back twice more in November. The numbers did not change in any way that offered him a different conclusion. He kept his notebook closed. To understand the full measure of what that closed notebook meant, it helped to see the two systems side by side in real terms. A family relying on cast iron through a Colorado winter at 9,000 feet would burn approximately 105 logs per week, nearly 800 pounds of wood, to maintain inferior temperature distribution, with the far corners of their cabins spending most of each night below 50 degrees. Zofia burned 28 logs across the same week, less than 210 pounds, to hold her cabin in the low 60s from wall to wall. Across 5 months, the difference amounted to nearly 2.5 cords of wood against less than 1 cord. At 1883 prices, that gap represented close to $18, nearly 2 weeks of wages for a mine worker spent on the privilege of sleeping colder. The cast iron stove demanded that fuel, demanded the nighttime feedings every 2 to 4 hours, demanded that someone always be awake to serve it. The clay stove asked for 2 hours of attention each morning and then provided the rest itself. December arrived in Harrow Gulch the way serious things arrive, without ceremony, without warning proportional to consequence. The first week brought cold in the range the settlement recognized as normal and managed accordingly. Fires maintained through the night, water buckets kept close to heat sources, livestock checked at intervals no one needed to be reminded of because they had all done it before. The Lucky Elk mine ran its morning shift slightly shorter. Children who would otherwise walk to school were kept home on the sharpest days. The community folded inward slightly, the way organisms do when temperatures drop, conserving energy, reducing exposure. Zofia burned her morning fire. She let it exhaust itself. The cabin held warmth. Marta wore a single wool sweater indoors. On the morning of December 16th, the temperature in Harrow Gulch dropped to 18 degrees below zero before sunrise and continued to fall. By mid-morning, it had reached 22 below. The wind arrived from the north in the early afternoon, pushing down from the highest ridges with a consistency that suggested it had no intention of stopping, driving the effective temperature to ranges that removed any ambiguity about survival. Exposed skin froze in under 2 minutes. The settlement went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when everyone has retreated behind walls and the streets belong only to the cold. The National Weather Service would not exist for another decade. There was no official forecast. But the oldest miners, the men who had lived through the territories of the worst seasons, walked outside that morning, read the sky and wind direction, looked at the particular quality of light on the eastern ridge, then walked back inside without saying anything to anyone. The silence itself was information. This cold would not lift in a day. It would not lift in 3. The settlement was looking at 11 consecutive days without relief, and no one who had spent serious time at this altitude in winter needed a thermometer to know it. Declan Fogarty woke at 2 in the morning on December 17th to find his cabin at 34 degrees. His cast-iron stove had burned through its fuel load an hour earlier. 4 wool blankets had proven insufficient against the rate of heat loss. The structure was hemorrhaging warmth through every gap in the plank walls, every imperfectly fitted window frame, every square foot of uninsulated surface exposed to air that was now 40 below zero with wind. He crossed the cabin floor in his boots and coat, breath visible as dense fog in his own home, the planks creaking under his feet with the sound of wood contracting in extreme cold. The stove door was nearly cold to the touch. He loaded 6 pieces of wood, waited for the fire to establish, stood with his back to the heat source, feeling the radiation warm the back of his coat while his face remained numb. In an hour, the area within 4 feet of the stove would be tolerable. The sleeping corner 12 feet away would remain in the 40s until the stove had been running for 3 hours. He would wake again at 5 to reload, then at 8, then at 11. The cycle would run without rest, consuming wood at a rate he had not anticipated when he made his winter purchases in October. His water bucket had a half-inch of ice at the surface. The interior walls near the window showed frost patterns that had not been present in November, the moisture from cooking and breathing condensing against surfaces cold enough to freeze it on contact. Fogarty sat down on the edge of his bed and did arithmetic that was not pleasant. He had purchased what he had calculated as a sufficient wood supply for the winter. The supply was correct for a normal winter. 18 below zero with sustained wind was not a normal winter. He would need to acquire more wood, from where, through what road conditions, at what additional cost before February. He already knew the answer was not a good one. Rupert Calloway's situation developed differently because it involved Owen. The boy had been coughing since the 18th, the familiar rattling cough that appeared in his chest each winter, and that Calloway had learned to treat as a signal requiring immediate response. This year the response was inadequate because the conditions that would have supported recovery, stable warmth, clean air, consistent temperature through the night, could not be maintained. The Calloway stove, a newer unit than Fogarty's but still cast iron, still dependent on continuous fuel and continuous attention, produced the same geography of heat and cold that plagued every cast iron installation in the settlement, fierce at the source, abandoned at the perimeter. Rebecca Calloway sat up through the night of the 19th with Owen, positioned as close to the stove as she could manage while keeping the boy's breathing elevated. The smoke from a fire run at the necessary intensity for warmth was sufficient to irritate mucous membranes already inflamed. Banking the fire lower to reduce smoke meant banking the temperature lower, which made the respiratory condition worse. There was no position in that cabin that provided what Owen needed. Dr. Vane came on the morning of the 20th, listened to the boy's chest, pressed 2 fingers against the lymph nodes below his jaw, sat back with the expression of someone deciding how to frame a difficult assessment. He needs consistent warmth above 60 degrees and air without particulate irritants. Vane's voice was careful and level, the clinical steadiness he used when the underlying concern was larger than what the words expressed. Not periodically warm, not warm near the stove, consistently warm throughout the space. What's happening to him in this temperature cycle? Warm for 2 hours, cold for 3, warm for 2. It's taxing his system more stable. Cold wood. Calloway looked at the stove. He looked at the thermometer on the far wall, reading 42 degrees at 10 in the morning. He looked at his son's face, which had the particular pallor of a child whose body is redirecting resources from surface to core. In the weeks since he had stood in Zofia Brandt's doorway and warned her about her child paying the price for her stubbornness, Calloway had thought of that afternoon infrequently. There had been no reason to think of it. The warning had seemed reasonable at the time, the kind of thing a sensible person says to someone making an obvious mistake. It returned to him now with the specific force of something that has been waiting for the right moment to become unbearable. The Harston family encountered a different category of failure on the night of December 20th. The stovepipe had been showing a hairline fracture since September, visible to anyone who looked closely at the section that passed through the ceiling. No one had looked closely. The fracture spread under the thermal cycling of extreme cold, opening wide enough by midnight of the 20th to allow carbon monoxide to seep into the sleeping area at concentrations that rose slowly over 2 hours while the family slept. Mrs. Harston woke at 3 in the morning with a headache that felt like pressure applied from inside the skull outward, nausea that hit immediately upon rising, and a specific quality of wrongness she recognized from an incident years earlier in Missouri, when a neighbor's family had been found in the morning in exactly the condition she was now working to prevent. She shook her husband awake. He responded slower than he should have, a sign she understood without deliberating over it. She pulled the children from their beds, their small bodies warm with sleep and already absorbing whatever was in the air, and moved everyone to the door in the 30 seconds between deciding to act and acting. Outside, the air temperature was 15 below zero. The children were in sleeping clothes. One of them, the younger one, 3 years old, began crying immediately at the shock of the cold, which was terrible but also evidence of responsiveness that Mrs. Harston needed to hear. They ran to the church. Father Brendan had not been sleeping. He had been sitting in the nave with a lamp, having one of the private conversations with God that extreme cold at high altitude tends to generate. He opened the church immediately, built the fires in both iron stoves with the rapid competence of a man who has maintained fires through difficult nights before, wrapped the children in everything available in the sacristy, sent a boy for Dr. Vane. By the morning of December 21st, 9 people were sheltering in the church. By evening, the number had climbed to 14. Gerald Aldrich Sr. did not come to the church. He was 73 years old and in no condition to navigate the 50 yards of frozen ground between the Aldrich house and the church in 15 below zero wind. He sat in the chair nearest the stove in his daughter's house, wrapped in blankets, his feet and hands showing the mottled color that Dr. Vane, when he arrived to check on him, identified without pleasure as early circulatory compromise. The temperature swings are as damaging as sustained cold at his age. Vane spoke quietly to Constance in the kitchen, away from where the old man sat. A cardiovascular system under this kind of thermal stress, warm for an hour, cold for 90 minutes, warm again. It's like forcing a pump to cycle at irregular intervals. Eventually something gives. He looked at the stove, at the single window through which the cold pressed against the glass with palpable insistence. He needs stable heat, not this. Listen to this assessment with the particular stillness of someone processing information that requires immediate action but offers no obvious path to it. The stove was the stove, the house was the house, the cold was the cold. She went back to her father's chair, took his hands in hers, felt the chill in his fingers that should not have been there. Gerald Aldrich Sr., whose mind came and went in the deep cold the way a radio signal comes and goes when interference is high, spoke in partial sentences that afternoon, mixing sense with memory in the way elderly men do when their defenses are depleted. He talked about California, about a place he had worked in his 40s, a mining operation in the northern part of the state where one of the workers had built a large stone heater in the bunkhouse. He described it the way people describe things they have no vocabulary for, by effect rather than mechanism, by feeling rather than engineering. It was warm in a way that was different, he said. Not hot then cold like a regular fire, just warm all the time. Even when there was no smoke. Constance had heard this story before. She had always heard it as the nostalgic embellishment of an old man who had worked in better conditions once and wanted to remember them. She had never heard it as information. She heard it differently now. Outside, Augustus Finch had spent December 10th through 21st trying to optimize his burn schedule with the precision of engineering applied to a problem that engineering could not solve. He established 6 fires per day, 4 in the morning, 8 in the morning, noon, 4 in the afternoon, 8 in the evening, midnight. Each burn lasted approximately 2 hours. He tracked cabin temperature at each interval in his notebook with the same methodical care he brought to mine equipment logs. The data was coherent and damning. Temperature during active burns, 62 to 65 degrees near the stove, 48 degrees at the far wall. Temperature between burns, falling steadily, bottoming at 41 to 43 degrees before the next fire elevated it again. His wife Caroline developed persistent headaches she attributed to the temperature oscillation, the way motion sickness develops not from speed but from inconsistency between what the body expects the environment to do and what the environment does. His wood consumption for the period December 16th through 21st, 144 pieces of wood, roughly 850 pounds. He had not calculated before winter what this rate would mean across 5 months. He calculated it now. The number required a second calculation to confirm because the first seemed too large. The second confirmed the first. He turned to the page in his notebook where he had recorded Sophia Brandt's consumption figures from his observations during 3 weeks earlier. 36 pounds of wood for a projected 18 to 22 hours of adequate warmth. He did the comparison slowly as though speed might change the result. His system consumed 23 times the fuel for inferior temperature distribution over the same period. He sat with this for a long time. Outside, the wind pushed at the cabin walls with the indifferent persistence of something that has nowhere else to be. Caroline pressed 2 fingers to her temple and looked at him from across the room with the particular expression that married people develop for watching each other fail to address something obvious. He opened his mouth once and closed it. The notebook was open to the comparison page on the table in front of him. The numbers had not changed. 17 Fenzimel at Harrow Gulch were now burning through their winter wood supplies at rates that would leave them with nothing before February. 3 men had attempted to haul additional timber over the canyon road on December 21st, pushing through waist-deep snow in temperatures that turned effort into emergency. They managed 1/4 cord between them before 2 of the 3 showed signs of serious frostbite severe enough to require immediate return. The nearest viable timber stood 6 miles out, and 6 miles in those conditions was not a distance. It was a calculation about what you were willing to risk to stay warm. Dr. Vane stood outside the church on the evening of December 22nd and allowed himself 60 seconds of the kind of unguarded assessment he normally reserved for his private journal. 14 people sheltering in the nave. Owen Calloway spiking a fever that had reached 103 degrees that afternoon. Gerald Aldrich Sr. barely conscious. The Harston children recovering from carbon monoxide exposure in conditions only marginally better than what they had escaped from. 3 of the 4 church volunteers showing exhaustion severe enough to create secondary risks. Men falling asleep at the wrong moment near open flames in extreme cold were men making their last mistake. He looked down the road toward the eastern edge of the settlement, where Sophia Brandt's cabin sat in its ordinary position, windows dark in the early evening, chimney showing nothing. No smoke, no light from a fire, nothing to indicate activity of any kind. In the 18 days since the serious cold had arrived, he had watched the settlement deteriorate with a speed that contradicted the confidence everyone had brought into the winter. He had treated cases that should not have occurred. He had watched the iron stove system, which he himself had defended on the grounds of basic physics, fail to provide what it had always promised it could provide: sustainable warmth through a Colorado winter at altitude. The physics had been correct in isolation. In the real conditions of 18 below zero with sustained wind and 11 straight days forecast without relief, the physics had been catastrophically insufficient. He had said that clay didn't conduct heat efficiently. He had been technically accurate. He had also been, in the way that technical accuracy sometimes produces, entirely wrong about what mattered. Vane walked toward the eastern edge of the settlement. He was not certain what he expected to find. He was almost certain, watching the smokeless chimney, that he would find Zofia and Marta in some state of emergency that his community had been too consumed with its own crisis to notice. He was a doctor. He walked toward the thing he was afraid of because walking toward it was what the work required. Rupert Calloway left Owen's side in the church at 7 in the evening with the specific heaviness of a man who has reached the point where staying still feels more dangerous than moving. He had told Rebecca he was going to check the cabin. He had not been entirely honest about what he intended to check. He walked east without quite admitting to himself why he was going east. He arrived at Sophia Brandt's door at the same moment as Dr. Vane from perpendicular directions in the 15 below zero dark of December 22nd, and neither of them said anything to the other about the coincidence. Sophia opened the door before either of them knocked. She had heard their boots on the frozen ground. She was wearing a single wool sweater. The heat that came through the open door was not the localized blast of a recently tended fire, not the aggressive directional warmth that iron stoves produce in their immediate radius. It was ambient, pervasive, the kind of warmth that indicates a space that has been warm for many hours, that has absorbed warmth into its walls and floors so thoroughly that the air itself holds it evenly. Calloway felt it on his face from 3 feet outside the threshold, standing in 15 below zero air. It was the most remarkable thing he had felt in 20 years of Colorado winters, and it was so simple and so complete that for a moment he could not identify what made it strange. Then he identified it. It felt like summer. He stepped inside. Vane followed. Marta looked up from the floor where she was arranging small carved wooden figures in a pattern only she understood, decided these visitors were not going to disrupt the project, returned to her work. Vane moved immediately to the thermometer on the north wall. 64 degrees. He moved to the window. 62 to the southeast corner, furthest from the stove. 63. He was a physician trained to distrust single data points and confirmed what he saw with additional observation before accepting it. Every location in the cabin registered within a 5-degree range. The distribution was not merely better than what he was accustomed to. It was a different category of result. Calloway placed his right hand flat against the surface of the clay stove, slowly the way you approach something you are not certain about. The surface was warm against his palm, the warmth of stone that has been in sunlight all day, accessible, non-threatening, consistent across every section of the surface he touched. He slid his hand to the corner of the structure, same temperature. He touched the surface near the base, same temperature. The heat was not coming from one place. It was coming from everywhere at once. He found the small iron door of the firebox at the stove's base. Opened it inside pale gray ash, fine as flour, with no visible coals, no residual ember, nothing that indicated heat at any level. The fire was completely out, had been out for hours. He looked at the ash, he looked at the thermometer Vane was still holding. He looked at the surface of the stove, which continued its patient radiation at the same steady temperature, indifferent to whether anyone was watching. "When did you last fire it?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. Zofia was at the small cooking stove in the corner, heating water. "This morning, 6 o'clock, 4 pieces of wood. I let it finish before breakfast. 13 hours. Calloway did the arithmetic without wanting to. Owen had started coughing on the 18th. The fever had reached 103 that afternoon. The boy was in the church right now in a space held at 50 degrees by 2 overworked iron stoves attended by men who were running out of the energy required to keep them burning. Vane set down the thermometer. He looked at Calloway with the directness of a man who has reached a decision. "Owen needs to be here." Calloway did not look at Zofia immediately. He looked at his own hands, still warm from pressing against the clay surface. He had stood in this doorway in November and told this woman that her child would pay the price for her stubbornness. The words had seemed reasonable then. They had seemed like the kind of clear-eyed assessment that people with experience owe to people who lack it. He had said them without hesitation. He looked at Zofia. The thing he needed to say was beyond what his vocabulary for this kind of moment could handle. He had no words for the specific combination of things he was feeling. The relief of a man standing in warmth, the guilt of a cold moment one child would suffer from a mistake turned out not to be a mistake, the simple, urgent practicality of a father whose son needed something this room possessed. He stood there holding all of it without speaking. Zofia did not make him find the words. "Bring him now," she said. "I'll prepare a place." She moved to the corner where Marta slept, began unfolding a second blanket, shifted the pallet to accommodate an additional person, her movements efficient in the way of someone for whom hospitality has always been logistical rather than performative. Marta watched her mother work for a moment, then stood up, gathered her carved figures, and disappeared into the corner with them, making room without being asked. Calloway left at a near run through the frozen dark toward the church. Vane remained, taking additional temperature readings, pulling his small journal from his coat pocket, making notes in the compressed shorthand he used for significant clinical observations. The pen moved for several minutes while the clay stove continued its quiet, total work, warming the air in contact with its surface, sending it to the ceiling, releasing it gradually across the room as it cooled, pulling it back. The convection cycle was not violent. It was barely visible in the motion of the lamplight flame, a slight steady oscillation. But the result was in every corner of that cabin, in the gap between the window frame and the wall, in the space behind the door, in the northeast corner where a 5-year-old girl slept each night without a coat. Finch arrived 20 minutes after Calloway had left, notebook under his arm. He had come with the intention of finally saying out loud what he had written in private 6 weeks earlier, which was the intention he had been approaching and retreating from since the 3rd week of November. He stood inside the door and looked around the cabin with the assessment eyes of an engineer reading a system in operation, then looked at the clay stove, then at Vane, then at the thermometer Vane was still holding. He took the notebook from under his arm, opened it to the page dated November 18th, handed it to Vane without explanation. Vane read the calculations, read them again. He looked up at Finch with an expression that was not quite anger. It had been too long a week for anger, but contained something adjacent to it. "You had this 6 weeks ago." Finch's voice was flat. "I wanted more data. I wanted certainty before I said anything publicly. Owen Calloway has been running a 103-degree fever since this afternoon." The sentence did not require a response. Finch accepted it the way you accept a weight handed to you when your hands are already full, because there is no alternative. He looked at the clay stove. He looked at his notebook. He had spent 6 weeks in the space between knowing something privately and saying it publicly, and the cost of that space had been paid by other people in currency he had not authorized and could not refund. This was the kind of arithmetic that did not appear in engineering notebooks because it had no units that pencils could manage. Zofia was at the cooking stove, not looking at either of them. The door opened. Calloway came through with Owen in his arms, the boy wrapped in the blankets from the church, his face visible above the wool, eyes open but glassy with fever. The heat of the cabin reached him immediately, not the aggressive spike of proximity to a stove, but the enveloping evenness of a space that had been warm for hours in every direction at once. Owen blinked. His breathing, audible and slightly labored, did not change immediately, but the small tension around his eyes, the subtle bracing that feverish children maintain against anticipated cold, released slightly. Calloway laid him on the pallet Zofia had prepared, pulled the blankets up, straightened and stood there with nothing to do, which was the most helpless position available. Vane crouched beside Owen, pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, the rise of his chest, counted, made a note. Marta came from her corner and set one of her carved figures, a small horse the most carefully made of the set, at the edge of Owen's pallet without comment. She returned to her corner, arranged the remaining figures, and resumed whatever the game had been before the visitors arrived. Nobody said anything about the horse. The clay stove radiated warmth at 120 degrees across its entire surface, evenly, without variation, the same as it had been doing since 6 in the morning, the same as it would be doing at midnight, 3 at 6 the next morning when Zofia would open the firebox to pale ash and begin the day's fire and charge the thermal battery for another cycle. Calloway sat down on the floor beside his son's pallet. He did not look at the stove. He did not look at Zofia. He looked at Owen's face, which was still too warm, still carrying the flush of a body fighting something it should not have had to fight. He looked at it for a long time. In the church, 14 people were trying to sleep on wooden pews. In Fogarty's cabin, a cast-iron stove burned through its 6th load of the day. The Aldrich house, Gerald Aldrich Sr. sat in his chair with mottled hands and a mind that moved in and out of the present like weather. In this cabin, the temperature was 64 degrees in every corner. The cold outside had not changed. The wind had not changed. The mathematics of survival at 9,200 feet in December had not changed. Only the system had changed, or rather, only here had the system been different from the beginning, built on different principles by someone who had known something the settlement had not been able to recognize as knowledge until the night it came to collect what it was owed. The lamp on the table threw its steady light. The carved figures stood in their arrangement in the corner. Owen, Calloway's breathing, gradual and small and measured by a physician who had been wrong about clay, continued its careful work in the warm air of a room that had no reason to be warm except that it was built to be exactly this. Owen Calloway's fever broke on the morning of December 25th. It broke the way fevers break when the body has finally been given what it needed to do its work, not dramatically, not with crisis, but with a gradual, almost apologetic retreat. Rebecca Calloway, who had spent 2 nights sleeping in the chair beside her son's pallet in Zofia's cabin, noticed it first in the quality of his breathing, which had lost the effortful, slightly wet quality that had frightened her since the 18th. She pressed her lips to his forehead, the maternal thermometer that no instrument has improved upon, held them there for 3 seconds, lifted her head with an expression that was not yet relief. Relief was too light a word for what crossed her face. But something older, something that lived below language in the place where mothers keep the things they cannot afford to say out loud until they are certain. She looked at Zofia, who was at the cooking stove, not watching but aware. "He's cooler," Rebecca said. Her voice was rough from the nights of limited sleep. "I think it broke." Zofia did not celebrate. She brought water warm, helped Owen drinks a small amount, checked. The color returned to the edge of his lips where the fever pallor had been concentrated. She moved with the competence of someone who had nursed people through illness before, who understood that the break in a fever is a threshold, not a conclusion, that the body continues its negotiation for several days after the obvious crisis passes. Dr. Vane arrived at 7 that morning with his bag, took Owen's temperature with the clinical thermometer, made the same assessment Rebecca had made 20 minutes earlier with her lips. 101, down from 103, trending correctly. He listened to the boy's chest, found the reading diminished though not absent, wrote in his journal with the careful neutrality that physicians use to describe outcomes they did not fully expect. Patient shows improvement consistent with therapeutic environment. Temperature stability overnight appears to have reduced systemic stress. Recommend continued observation in current location for minimum 48 additional hours. He closed the journal, looked at the clay stove which was 2 hours into its morning burn, the firebox running hot and white at its core. Then he looked at Zofia with the directness of a man who has spent 2 weeks revising an opinion he expressed with professional confidence and has decided that further delay serves no one. "I was wrong about the clay," he said, "not about the conductivity. That's accurate as a physical property. I was wrong about what conductivity means in this context. The system doesn't need to conduct heat quickly. It needs to hold heat reliably. Those are different requirements." Zofia accepted this with a nod, neither generous nor withholding. "I intend to document the clinical effects," he continued. "The improvement in Owen's condition, the temperature distribution data I've collected over the past 3 days. I want a record that other physicians can reference." He paused. Would you allow me to take regular measurements here through the remainder of the winter? Come whenever you need to, Zofia told him. Augustus Finch arrived at 8 that morning with his notebook already annotated extensively with our observations he had recorded the previous night while the rest of the settlement was otherwise occupied. He had been awake since 4, working through the full comparison he had been approaching for 6 weeks, finally committing the analysis to paper in permanent form rather than the provisional shorthand he had been using since November, as though writing it in pencil meant it could still be revised. He had written it in ink. He watched Zofia's morning burn from start to finish, timing each phase with the pocket watch he used to track mine equipment cycles. He recorded the figures with the same thoroughness he had brought to his previous observations, then sat down at Zofia's small table and asked if he could walk through the physics with her directly, question by question, so that he could be certain his understanding was correct rather than approximate. They spent 2 hours doing this. What emerged from the conversation was not simply a confirmation of what Finch had already calculated, but a more complete picture of why the system worked. The relationship between firebox temperature and flue gas capture, the way the internal channel geometry forced maximum contact between hot gas and thermal acid, the specific material properties of the clay deposit she had identified upstream, the role of the river rock in the core where temperatures were highest. Finch asked questions that forced Zofia to articulate things she had understood by feel, to translate body language into language precise enough for an engineer's notebook. The process was useful for both of them. At the end of it, Finch looked at the stove for a long time without speaking. Then I had the efficiency numbers in November. I sat on them. The sentence was plain, stripped of deflection. I told myself I needed more certainty. The honest version is that I needed more courage. Zofia looked at him with the same level gaze she had given all of them throughout. You came back to check your work. Not everyone does. Owen Calloway was in the church with 103 fever. Yes, that's the consequence of what I chose. She did not absolve him of it. She did not add to it. She left the statement exactly where he had placed it, which was the most honest thing she could have done. Declan Fogarty came on the morning of December 26th with his hat in both hands, which was not a gesture he had planned, but one his body made without consulting him when Zofia opened the door. He was a large man reduced to something smaller by the weight of what he had come to say, which was not complicated but required him to hold his professional identity and his recent error in the same hands simultaneously, which is harder than it sounds for men who have built their authority on competence. I built 47 structures in this settlement, he said, standing in the doorway. Not one of them heats the way this room heats. He stopped, restarted. I told you it wouldn't work. I was wrong. Not wrong because I was careless. I was wrong because I had never encountered this before, didn't recognize it, applied what I knew to something my knowledge didn't cover. A pause. I'd like to learn how to build one, if you're willing to teach a man who told you to give it up. Zofia stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. I'll make coffee. They spent 3 hours at table with charcoal on flat pieces of wood, Zofia drawing sections, cross-sections, elevation views of the internal channel system, the firebox proportioning, the chimney seal at the roofline. Fogarty had the attention of a craftsman encountering a new discipline. Total, physical, the kind of listening that involves the hands as much as the ears, reaching to touch the surface or the dimension being described as though information arrives more reliably through contact than through instruction. He asked about the trowel angle for pressing channel surfaces to minimize cracking. He asked about the clay-to-sand ratio at the firebox wall compared to the outer surface. He asked about curing time, about what weather conditions to avoid during construction, about the specific sound the channel walls should make when tapped if the density was correct. By the end of the 3rd hour, Fogarty had covered 6 pieces of scrap wood with his own sketches, corrections over corrections, dimensions and notes in the cramped hand of a man who has spent decades on construction sites where paper was scarce. He held the last piece at arm's length looking at it. I want to build this for my own house first, he said. I need to understand it with my hands before I build it for anyone else. That's how I've always worked. That's the right way, Zofia told him. He left with the sketches held carefully under his arm, as though they were documents rather than charcoal on scrap wood. At the door he paused with the quality of a man who has more to say but has not found the form for it yet. Finally, I'll build 7 more this spring for families who can't do it themselves. Materials cost only, no wage. He put his hat on. It's what I owe. Constance Aldrich came on the 27th with a basket containing bread she had baked that morning, which was the thing she knew how to do when apology exceeded language. She had been composing what she wanted to say for 5 days, in the incremental, careful way she composed everything, and she had revised it so many times that by the time she arrived she was not certain she still had the original version. She set the basket on the table. She surveyed the cabin, the stove, Martaban playing in the corner, the clinical thermometer Vane had left hanging on the north wall, the sketches Zofia had made for Fogarty's instruction now stacked near the window. Then she looked at Zofia and said the thing she had been building toward. I told you that what works in your home country won't work here. I said Colorado is different. Zofia waited. My father told me about a heating system he had seen when he worked in California. A large stone structure, warm all day without fire. He described it exactly the way this room feels. Constance's voice was composed but required maintenance to stay that way. I dismissed it. I thought he was misremembering, embellishing, doing what old men do when they want the present to pay attention to the past. She pressed her lips together for a moment. He was on the edge of serious harm 3 nights ago because I couldn't maintain the temperature he needed. He knew. He had been trying to tell me for years. I decided I knew better. Zofia was quiet for long enough that Constance had to resist the impulse to fill the silence with additional explanation. Then your father knew because someone showed him the way someone showed me. The knowledge is old. It travels in people, not in books. When the person who carries it is dismissed, it stops traveling. A pause. You didn't know you were dismissing knowledge. You thought you were managing an old man's nostalgia. Constance's composure held till it didn't. A single controlled break quickly recovered. He's going to be all right, she said, which was partly a statement of current fact. Gerald Aldrich Sr. having improved significantly, once Constance had arranged for him to spend his days in the cabin of a neighbor who planned a higher fire than she could, partly a declaration she needed to make out loud to confirm it was true. I'm glad, Zofia said, meaning it entirely. Dr. Elias Vane spent the days between Christmas and the New Year documenting what he had observed with methodical care, his journal filling with data that no medical school curriculum had prepared him to collect. Temperature readings at 6 points in Zofia's cabin over 48 hours, range of 4 degrees across the entire space, floor to ceiling, wall to wall. Owen Calloway's respiratory rate on arrival versus 48 hours later, measurably improved. Carbon monoxide incidents in the settlement during the cold snap, 3, all from iron stove households with compromised pipes or damped fires. Carbon monoxide incidents from masonry-heated spaces, 0, structurally impossible given the combustion pattern. He wrote at the close of the final entry for December, the cold itself is survivable. What nearly broke this settlement was the inadequacy of our response to it. We chose speed of heat over duration of heat, and we paid the cost of that choice across 11 days. Rupert Calloway's reckoning came without performance. On the morning of December 29th, Owen sat up on his own for the first time since arriving in the cabin, asked for water, drank it without assistance, looked around the room with the alert curiosity of a child whose fever has fully released its grip. The boy had been in the room for 7 days. He knew where the lamp was, knew the sound the cooking stove made when Zofia added wood, knew the specific quality of the warmth that was present when he woke each morning, not variable, not localized, simply present, as reliable as the fact of the floor under the pallet. Calloway sat beside him through the morning, watching him eat a small amount of the soft bread Rebecca had brought, watching color return to his face in the gradual, particular way it returns when it comes back to stay rather than visiting. He did not speak for most of that time. He had been in this cabin 7 days himself, coming and going, sleeping 2 nights in the chair when Rebecca went home to rest. He had observed the morning burns, had watched Zofia load the firebox with the specific configuration that achieved maximum combustion temperature, had watched her let the fire exhaust itself completely to ash, had watched the cabin temperature hold through the day with no additional fuel. That afternoon, Owen dozed after the bread, and Calloway sat in the chair beside the pallet, watching his son sleep with the helpless, total attention of a parent who has been frightened for their child and is not quite ready to stop being frightened even after the immediate danger has passed. Zofia was in the cooking corner with her back to him, preparing something for the evening meal. The room was 63 degrees. The clay stove made no sound, it simply warmed. He hadn't intended to speak, but the words came out of the silence the way things come out of silences that have been held too long. I nearly lost him, he said. Not to Zofia specifically, to the room, to the fact of Owen sleeping in it, to the winter that had exposed what he had not known he didn't know. I've done 19 winters here. I thought I knew what was required. I had no idea. Zofia did not turn from what she was doing. She gave him the privacy that people give each other when important things are said in the pretense of not speaking to anyone in particular. The thing I said to you, he continued. His voice had the quality of something that has been stored under pressure. In November, about your daughter. The room waited. That was wrong, he said. Not wrong because you turned out to be right. Wrong because it was the kind of wrong that comes from knowing enough to be confident but not enough to be correct, and I said it to you as though confidence and correctness were the same thing. He looked at Owen's sleeping face. I won't make that exchange again. Zofia set down what she was working on, turned toward the room without quite turning toward him, occupying the middle distance between the cooking corner and where he sat. You brought him here, she said. In 15 below zero in the dark, you brought your sick child to the only warm place available even though you had told me it wasn't worth building. A brief pause. That's the correction. You made it when it mattered. This was more than he had earned, and both of them knew it, which was why it landed the way it did, not as absolution but as something rarer. The specific generosity of someone who has chosen not to require from others what they have not required from themselves. Marta appeared from behind the stove, carrying the small carved horse she had returned to its place at Owen's pallet each morning since he arrived. She set it on the edge of the pallet with the matter-of-fact care of a child performing a ritual that has become established through repetition. Then she looked at Calloway with the direct, uncomplicated assessment that 5-year-olds bring to adults when they have been observing them for several days. "He's better today," she said. "He ate." "He did," Calloway agreed. Marta nodded, satisfied with the confirmation, and returned to whatever she had been doing. The community meeting that Father Brendan convened in the second week of March was not a formal proceeding. The church calendar did not designate it. Father Brendan had simply sent word through the settlement that there would be a gathering on Saturday afternoon to discuss construction plans for the spring, a practical frame for what everyone understood would be something more than a construction meeting. By 2 o'clock, the nave held approximately 80 residents, standing in the aisles, sitting on the window ledges, filling the spaces between pews with the particular density of a community that has shared something difficult together. Calloway stood before the cold had finished settling in the room. He had not spoken to Father Brendan in advance about doing this. He simply stood up when the room had gone quiet enough, which was the instinct of a man accustomed to operating in situations where someone needs to speak first. He told what had happened without softening any of it: the temperature readings in his cabin on the morning of December 17th, Owen's cough beginning the 18th, the diagnosis, what Vane had said about the boy needing consistent warmth, his own burn schedule, and how it was failing. The night of December 22nd, walking east in 15 below zero dark. Not quite knowing why he was walking east, finding Vane already there, both of them arriving at the same door from different directions, because the same recognition had driven them both through the cold without requiring them to name it first. He described opening the firebox door, the white ash, the thermometer reading 64 degrees in a room that had last seen fire 13 hours earlier. "I told this woman in November that her child would pay the price for her stubbornness." He let the silence after the sentence do what silence does when it has genuine weight. "I was wrong about the stove. I was wrong about who needed to worry about their child. I sat in that cabin for 7 days watching a system I had dismissed perform beyond anything I understood was possible." He looked at the assembled faces. "This settlement has been heating itself wrong. Not wrong for a temperate climate or a lower elevation. Wrong for here. Wrong for 9,000 feet in December in Colorado. We've been losing wood, losing sleep, losing health, losing people to frost and carbon monoxide and respiratory illness because we've been doing this the expensive, inefficient way when the correct way was being demonstrated 40 yards from the center of town." He sat down. The room held its quiet. Augustus Finch rose next. He had brought his notebook, which he opened to the November pages, and he read the thermal efficiency comparison aloud without editorial commentary, the BTU figures, the fuel consumption ratios, the flue gas temperatures, the efficiency percentages, the surface temperature differential. He read them the way engineers read data, with the confidence of someone who trusts that numbers speak for themselves if given the opportunity. Then he closed the notebook. "I had this on November 18th, he said. "I chose not to share it publicly until I had more certainty. The people in this room spent 6 more weeks burning 3 times the wood for worse results because I made that choice." He looked at the notebook in his hands. "I won't defend it. I'm recording it so the community has an accurate account of what happened." Fogarty stood third. His announcement was brief. 7 stoves, spring construction, materials cost only, his own labor donated, starting with the families whose iron stoves had failed during the cold snap and ending with whoever remained on the list when he ran out of season. He said it with the flat practicality of someone who has decided what they owe and is not interested in negotiation about the terms. Father Brendan invited Zofia to speak. She stood. The room that had been full of confident voices in November was entirely quiet now. 80 people who had individually or collectively told her she was wrong about the thing she turned out to be most right about. She stood in that quiet for a moment without filling it. "I knew you would think I was wrong when I started," she said. Her English carried the slight formality of someone who learned the language at an age when grammar was deliberate rather than absorbed. "Where I grew up, people looked at this kind of stove the same way you did the first time. It looks like too much. Too large, too slow, too committed to a method that isn't immediately obvious." She looked around the room. "I didn't argue with you in November because I have learned something about how people change their minds. They don't change them because they are told to. They change them when they feel the difference themselves, in their own bodies, in their own houses. I could have spent the winter explaining. Instead, I built the stove." A pause. "You came to feel it. That was always going to be the way this ended. A voice from the back of the room. Why didn't you explain it from the beginning? Why not try? Zofia looked toward the voice. My English was not good enough in October to explain thermal mass and flue gas efficiency. By the time it was good enough, you had already decided what I was. An explanation from a woman who had already been decided about would not have been heard the same way as a room that was 64 degrees when the fire had been out for 13 hours. She looked at the room again. I am sorry it cost people what it cost them. I would have preferred a different sequence. But I don't know how to make people feel something they haven't felt yet. The room was quiet for a count of several seconds. Then Constance Aldrich from her seat near the front stood up. She did not say anything. She simply stood in the way that people in a room stand when they are indicating a position rather than making a speech, and began to clap. The sound moved through the nave the way warmth moves through a clay-filled room, not all at once, not from a single source, but gradually from multiple points filling the available space until it was everywhere at once. The Saturday teaching sessions began in the second week of March, when the worst of the cold had retreated enough to allow movement without the constant calculation of exposure time. Father Brendan offered the church hall. Zofia accepted the offer without negotiating its terms. The first session drew 23 people. By the third Saturday, 41. Fogarty sat in the front row with his notebook open every week, asking the construction questions that Zofia could not always anticipate because they emerged from the practical problems of a builder working through execution rather than a designer working through theory. Finch sat 2 rows back and occasionally answered questions that required mathematical framing before Zofia had finished translating them into figures. The collaboration between the three of them, Zofia's experiential knowledge, Finch's quantitative frame, Fogarty's construction expertise, produced something more complete than any single one of them possessed independently. Father Brendan helped with translation when Zofia's English reached its current edge. She was extending that edge weekly. Her vocabulary for thermodynamics was expanding faster than her vocabulary for social niceties, which told something about where her attention lived. The question of payment came up twice in the first month of sessions. Both times Zofia turned it aside with the same few words, "This isn't mine to sell." When someone pressed her on where she had learned it, who had taught her, what she owed to that knowledge, she was quiet for a moment before answering. "Someone who is no longer living," she said finally. "She would not have charged me for it. I don't know how to charge you." The spring construction began in late April when the ground thawed sufficiently for the foundation work, and the mornings held above freezing long enough for clay to cure without the risk of frost damage. Fogarty broke ground on the second stove on the 23rd of April, his own house as promised, the one he needed to understand with his hands before he built it for anyone else. He worked from the sketches he had made at Zofia's table in December, consulting her at intervals about specific decisions where his own judgment was uncertain, approaching the work with the combination of professional rigor and student humility that distinguished him from the man who had stopped his wagon outside her cabin in November. The brick facing he added to the exterior was his own contribution, aesthetics, he said, though the community understood it as craftsmanship, the mark of a builder who could not leave a surface unresolved. The core physics were Zofia's design exactly. By the end of spring, 31 families had begun construction of their own masonry heaters, each one built on the principles Zofia had demonstrated through a winter that had made those principles impossible to dismiss. Constance Aldrich's innovation came from the problem she had been trying to solve since Gerald Aldrich Sr. had described the warmth of that California bunkhouse from his chair in December. She wanted to bake bread without the separate fuel cost of heating the range oven, which consumed wood at rates that strained the household budget, even with the masonry heater reducing the primary heating load. She proposed to Zofia the possibility of integrating a baking surface into the upper section of the thermal mass, where temperatures during peak burn were highest. Zofia worked through the proportioning with her over 2 afternoons, adjusting the internal geometry to accommodate a usable surface without disrupting the flue channel path. The result was a structure that heated the house. Baked bread with residual thermal energy required no additional fuel beyond the daily morning fire. Constance baked her first successful loaf from it in the second week of June and brought 3 of them to Zofia's cabin without announcing she was coming. Finch's adaptation came from the same engineering instinct that had made him skeptical in November, the conviction that any system losing energy through its exhaust is a system with room for improvement. He designed a secondary chamber that connected to the main chimney path before the exit point, routing a portion of the remaining heat through a copper vessel large enough to hold 8 gallons of water. The system preheated washing and cooking water using thermal energy that would otherwise have been released to the atmosphere at 250 degrees. The efficiency gain was modest relative to the overall system, but for a family that had previously heated wash water from cold each day over a wood fire, it represented a meaningful reduction in daily fuel consumption. What these variations demonstrated was that Zofia had not given the settlement a design, she had given them a principle. The difference was generative. A design is a fixed answer to a specific question. A principle generates its own questions, each adaptation revealing the next possibility, the community's active intelligence distributing itself across the problem in ways that a single builder working in isolation could not have reached. The economic effects moved through the settlement more slowly than the physical effects, but with equivalent force. Wood costs for households with masonry heaters dropped by 62 to 7% in the winter of 1884 to 1885 compared to the previous year. The money that had been purchased as smoke represented for a family earning a miner's wages, the difference between endurance and margin, between a winter that consumed all resources for survival and a winter that left something over for other purposes. Dr. Vane documented the health consequences in his medical journal. Respiratory illness rates in the settlement reduced measurably, frostbite cases in masonry-heated households essentially absent, carbon monoxide incidents among adapted households zero. Father Brendan wrote to the diocese in August, describing the innovation, the technical principles, the community process of adoption. The letter was forwarded to 3 other Colorado settlements where the same problems existed without the same solution. By the end of 1884, builders in those communities had made contact with Fogarty, who sent his sketches along with annotations, who invited the most serious inquirers to come to Harrow Gulch and see the stoves themselves. The knowledge was most effectively transmitted by the same method it had been demonstrated here, not argument but evidence, not explanation but experience, not the map but the territory. April gave way to May, the day extended. The specific quality of light in the Elk Ridge Valley changed from the flat, winter-starved light of early spring to something richer, more sustaining, the kind of light that arrives when the angle of the sun relative to the mountains shifts enough to reach the valley floor for more than 6 hours at a time. The snow retreated up the slopes, the creek ran higher than it had since the previous spring, fed by the melt. Zofia burned her morning fire for the last time that season on the 14th of April, let it run its 2 hours, let it exhaust itself to ash. She would not start another until October. The clay structure would hold residual warmth for several days as the ambient temperature rose. Then it would cool gradually to the surrounding air temperature. And it would wait, patient in the way that stone is patient, which is to say without awareness of waiting, simply present until fall. Marta was in the doorway, 1 foot inside the cabin, 1 foot outside, negotiating the boundary between the indoor life she had spent the winter in and the outdoor life that was opening up again. She was 5 years old, taller than she had been in October, changed in the small, accelerating ways that children change in the years when growth is fastest. She had learned 47 words in English since October, which she categorized internally by usefulness, warmth, food, and horse were in the highest priority category, and was working on a letter to the girl next door that Father Brendan was helping her compose. "Mama," she said, half inside, half outside, one hand on the doorframe. "The stove is still warm." Zofia pressed her palm flat against the clay surface. The warmth pushed back into her hand with the unhurried, total certainty of material that has done this thousands of times and will do it thousands more. She held her hand there. "Mama," Marta's voice carried the slight impatience of a child who has asked a question and is waiting for the answer to be confirmed rather than demonstrated. "It doesn't forget," you said, Zofia had said. In November, to herself, to Marta half asleep, to the structure still learning what it was meant to do. She had said it because it was true in the way she understood truth, not theoretically, not mathematically, but bodily, the truth that lives as materials and practices older than the languages used to describe them, passed through hands rather than texts, demonstrated rather than argued. "No," she said, "it doesn't forget." She took the answer as settled, pivoted on the doorframe, launched herself into the April morning where the first warm light of the season was reaching the settlement floor for the first time in months. Her boots on the porch steps, her voice calling to someone down the road, the door swinging in her wake. The cabin held its quiet. The clay stove continued its slow, patient release of the last warmth from the last fire of the season. Zofia stood with her hand against it a moment longer, neither holding on nor letting go, simply feeling what was there. Zofia Brandt lived in Harrow Gulch until March of 1902, when influenza came through the settlement in its particular way of coming through places, efficient, indifferent, without concern for what a community can afford to lose. She was 47. She had spent 19 years as a seamstress, occasional nurse, and the person people came to when they needed to understand how to build something that held warmth reliably through difficult conditions. She had not charged for any of the teaching. She had not kept a record of the stoves she had helped design or the people she had walked through construction. She had answered questions at the door, at the table, on the path to the creek, in the margins of other conversations. The knowledge passed from her to the settlement the way it had passed to her, by proximity, by demonstration, by the radical act of one person showing another person what their hands already knew. Those who attended her funeral in March of 1902 were numerous enough that the church held less than half of them. The remainder stood outside in the cold without complaint, which told something about what they understood the weather to owe her. Marta Brandt grew up in the cabin with the clay stove. She attended normal school in Colorado Springs, returned to teach in Harrow Gulch for 8 years, then moved to Denver where she continued teaching until 1928, when she married and turned her attention to raising her own children. She lived until 1961, dying at 83 in Denver, with grandchildren who heard the story of the winter of 1883 as something that had happened to someone else in another century, in conditions so difficult they required the imagination to credit them fully. She told the story the way her mother had told her, not as triumph but as information, not as vindication but as physics. The cabin burned in a wildfire that swept the eastern edge of Harrow Gulch in 1908, driven by the same kind of dry August wind that periodically reasserted the mountain's terms over the settlement's plans. The wood structure went quickly, the plank walls, the roof, the cooking stove, the window frames, the door, all of it consumed in the particular total way that wood burns when the conditions are right. The clay stove stood. It stood in the debris of what had surrounded it, damaged by fallen timbers, scorched on its upper surfaces where the roof collapsed. But structurally intact, the dense clay mass too thick to crack from heat that moved across its exterior, the river stone core holding its integrity because it had been selected and cured for exactly this kind of stress. It stood for 34 more years in the open air, exposed to wind and rain and the freezing cycles of 34 Colorado winters, weathering slowly at its edges, becoming something between a ruin and a monument, visited occasionally by people who had heard the story and wanted to see the evidence. It was demolished in 1942 when mining expansion required the land. The machinery that broke it apart was more powerful than anything Harrow Gulch had possessed in 1883, and even so the demolition took longer than expected. No archaeological trace remains now. The site sits beneath the infrastructure of a town that has been built and rebuilt over the landscape of the original settlement, which is the ordinary fate of places where the ground is valuable enough to keep improving. What the ground holds if you could reach it would not tell you much. Some river rock of the type found anywhere along the creek bed, clay subsoil of the gray-blue variety present in the deposits 3 miles upstream, which is still there, still the same color, still the same density, still holding the thermal properties that Zofia identified by pressing it between her fingers on an October afternoon in 1883. The knowledge survived better than the physical evidence. Declan Fogarty's sketches, annotated and re-annotated through the spring construction projects, were copied by the builders who came from other settlements to observe and carried back to their own communities. Father Brendan's diocesan correspondence circulated further than he had anticipated. Augustus Finch published a technical note in a Colorado engineering publication in 1886, seeing specific thermal efficiency figures, which were read by builders in 2 states who wrote back to ask where to find more information. The knowledge moved the way she had moved, not announced, not promoted, simply carried forward by people who had felt the difference and could not unfeel it. People who were cold built the stove and were warm. They told other cold people. The cold people built the stove. In the winter of 1883, one woman stood with her palm against clay she had hauled 3 miles by wheelbarrow in a cabin at 9,000 feet in a settlement that had told her with collective certainty that what she was building would fail. The clay pushed warmth back into her hand. Her daughter slept without shivering for the first time since they had arrived. Outside, the wind came down from Elk Ridge, and the whole settlement waited for the evidence of her failure, and the evidence never came. And eventually the cold came hard enough that the absence of evidence became evidence of something else entirely. The clay holds what it is given. It does not forget. That is not a metaphor. That is physics. But it is also in the particular way of things that are both true and useful at the same time, something more.